Today, the 30th of November, is Magnus Carlsen's birthday. The question was, could he give himself a nice birthday present with a first win in this World Championship match? So he had the white pieces. Now, if you remember in game 2, he played with the Queen's pawn. Today, it was with the King's pawn. So he obviously just wanted to find out exactly what his opponent, the challenger, Nepomniachtchi, had against e4. And, well, I don't think a big surprise. Nepo has obviously prepared very well and prepared very solid openings. So against d4, he was playing d5, and against e4, e5. And not even knight c6 here, but instead knight f6, the Petrov. So he played this in the candidates tournament successfully against Wang Hao, winning a really nice game. And if you recall, this was exactly the opening that Fabiano Caruana used to block out Magnus in the 2018 World Championship match. So the question is, in 3 years, could Magnus find something against this Petrov, this super solid opening? You can see that a couple of pawns have been exchanged, but basically it's a symmetrical pawn structure. So White's challenge is to try to find something that unbalances the position. And it's not easy. But White is the first to strike out. So that attempts to undermine the d5 pawn. See, there's pressure here and here. But Black is super solid and protects that pawn. Rook e1 from Carlsen. There are several moves that have been tried in this position. Rook e1 is very logical. In fact, neither player had arrived at this position previously, but it is a well-known variation at the top level in chess. Bishop f5, so that supports the knight. It's very logical. And queen b3, also a logical move. Now that that bishop has moved away, the queen attacks the pawn on b7. Queen d7 defends the pawn. Knight c3, and that just adds pressure to the knight. So it's time to play knight takes knight. Bishop takes bishop, so we have some exchanges. Queen takes bishop on f5. And here you could say the main move is to play queen takes pawn. And this has been played before and leads inevitably to this endgame, which has been tested on a few occasions. But basically, Black should be okay there. It's a tricky position, but Black should be okay. That's you could say the main line. Instead, Carlsen played pawn takes knight on c3, which is a quiet continuation. So this pawn is still attacked, so b6 blocks that attack. And c takes d5 and queen b5. Now, there's a particular idea behind this queen move. And that's to, well, the queen controls some very nice squares here and puts a bit of pressure here. So White perhaps wants to play pawn to c4, exploiting that pin along the 5th rank. So that's why the queen comes back. Now, of course, well, if queen takes pawn, then bishop takes pawn check would win that queen. Nice discovered attack. And this position has been seen before, a game between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave against Fabiano Caruana. Stavanger 2017 went rook b1, supporting the queen, but well, it wasn't good enough. It was a fairly tame continuation. Game ended in a draw. Instead, Carlsen played a4, which has also been seen before, and actually Michael Adams from England won a very nice game when his opponent Morozevich played rook d8 here. But instead, pretty quickly, Nepo exchanged queens and played a5. So you can see in this position, that pawn, you could say it's a backward pawn, there's pressure here. But by playing a5, that just kind of relieves the pressure on the a pawn. And it's now a protected pass pawn, which, you know, has potential for later on in the game. And here, previously, we've seen this move, which basically just exchanges pawns, and there's not a lot to play for in that position. That's very level. But here is where Carlsen sprung the first surprise of the game. Instead of exchanging pawns, he kept the tension and played knight h4. So what's this one about? Well, that knight clearly wants to bounce in and attack the bishop. And, well, on f5 it's quite menacing looking at these squares. So a natural response from Nepo, just g6 to shut out the knight. Now the knight looks very strange at the side of the board. Where's it going? You know, they always say knights on the rim are dim. But this knight has a plan. g4. So it looks a little strange to advance that pawn in front of the king, but the idea is it gives the knight a route back, and the knight is looking to come to one of these squares to hit that isolated pawn on d5. So this is Carlsen's quite deep strategic plan. Then again, quite a lot of pieces have been exchanged, so one ought to think that black is okay here. Nepo obviously a little bit surprised. You know, he was taking his time, but you know, this a pawn is quite a trump. Knight d7, of course, black has to bring the pieces out. Knight g2, so Carlsen continues with his plan. And now rook c8. Rook fc8, attacking that pawn on c3. Now, if white slows down here, if white plays, for example, bishop d2, defending that pawn, then black could well get the advantage here. So, for example, knight here, attacking the pawn, and wanting to come in here, so f3. And now knight e8, the knight can come to this c7 square, defending the d5 pawn and also attacking here. And that's unpleasant for white, actually. But that, of course, wasn't Carlsen's intention. But, you know, this is a nice plan from Nepo. You know, he's not defending passively. He's you know, looking to play aggressively as well. Carlsen played bishop f4. And I'm sure that he was still in his opening preparation, whereas Nepo was having to think things through a bit. And Nepo now spent 10.5 minutes over the exchange. So that knight has come back into play and looks here, but Nepo can take the pawn on c3. So an exchange of pawns, rook takes c3, knight takes d5, and now rook d3, attacking the pawn. So once again, if white plays passively here, then it could end up with this pawn being a very powerful runner down the board. So, you know, something like rook d1 here, exchanging rooks, I think would be terrible. But Carlsen quickly played rook e7. The knight came back to f8, which seems, you know, a little bit passive, but basically, you know, this rook here does a good job of behind this pawn, and this a pawn is waiting in the wings. Knight f6 check, king g7. Now Carlsen repeated moves, knight e8 check, king g8. Or at least he has the option to repeat moves. He played pawn to d5. Of course, if that's taken, then knight f6 check wins the rook on d5. So pawn to a4. So Nepo finds counterplay with his own passed pawn protected by the rook. It's a strong move. If black doesn't go for this, then there's always the potential for the second rook to enter the game. Knight f6 check, king g7, and g5 cements that knight in on that fine square f6. Question is, can white use that? You know, if we could transport one of these rooks to g8, then that would be checkmate, but the knight on f8 is shutting out white's rooks. And, well, Nepo pushed on with a3. This is quite serious. So this position could easily turn, and black could be better here. And here is where Carlsen really went into the tank for the first time. He had a very long think. He thought for over half an hour over this move, knight e8 check. The king goes backwards, and then he checked again. So he repeated the position, and then he had another long think. So that was really an indication that, well, his plans had hit the buffers and Nepo had defended successfully. And in fact, after another think of almost quarter of an hour, he checked again, repeated the position, and that meant a draw. So could he have played on? Well, he was working hard in that long think, but couldn't come up with anything. The obvious move for white is to advance the d pawn. Now, if that's taken, then knight e8 check wins that rook, or wins one of the rooks anyway, with a fork check and taking the rook. So, well, what would black do about that? In fact, black can defend well with knight e6. So that knight looks at this pawn here, but also covers this square. So white pushes on. Let's just see what happens. And then rook d8 is possible, just solidly behind that pawn. So there's a threat to take here. So pawn to h4, h6. It's still absolutely fine. White protects with f4. It's even possible to take there, but okay, let's play in the simplest way for black. Let's exchange and just play king here, attacking the rook, which looks a bit scary, but actually after the check, the king comes out. Rook g8 is not mate because the rook can take it. If rook takes rook, knight takes rook, and black is absolutely fine there. It's not possible for white to activate the rook when this pawn is so far advanced. And here, well, the rook just has to come back. And after king f8, that is just going to be a draw. If white plays instead, for example, king f2, then it's possible to take here. So if knight takes, then rook takes rook, that'll end in a draw. And rook takes, well, this ends in a draw. So, I mean, Carlsen could have tried a couple more moves, but basically he exhausted the position and realised he wasn't actually going to get anywhere. So just repeated the moves. And at move 33, they agreed a draw. Well, it's a threefold repetition, and that's a draw. So, 4 draws in the first 4 games of the World Championship match. It is very tight indeed. Carlsen said afterwards, when you play a forced line as today, you don't expect to hit very often. And indeed, Nepo defended very stoutly. He was obviously a little bit surprised by this move, knight h4, but not sufficiently that he was too rattled. And Magnus also added, it's a normal result against a well-prepared opponent. So let's have a quick look at the scores. Here we go. It's 2-2, 4 draws after 4 games. It is a very tight match indeed. Nepomniachtchi showing that he has come very well prepared indeed and playing much more solid openings than normal. No Najdorfs, not yet anyway. Here's the match schedule. Tomorrow, 1st of December, is game 5. Remember, 3 days on Mondays and Thursdays. And if you want to follow the match, do check out the Oslo studio of Chess24, hosted by Kaya, and for a deep dive into the position There's Judith Polgar and Anish Giri, who have really high quality analysis of the games. There you go. Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow for Game 5.